In this episode, we're going to move from policy, which sets the big rules, to standards, which define what responsible AI must look like in practice. Policies answer questions like what is allowed and what requires approval, but standards answer questions like what evidence is required, what documentation must exist, what fairness expectations apply, and what oversight must be in place before anyone relies on AI outputs. Beginners sometimes think ethics is a philosophical topic that belongs in a classroom, but in responsible AI work, ethics becomes operational because it shapes real choices about people, data, and outcomes. Fairness is not just a feeling. It becomes an expectation about how the system behaves across groups and contexts. Transparency is not just being honest. It becomes a requirement for explainability, communication, and traceability. Oversight is not just a manager checking a box. It becomes a defined control structure that makes accountability real. When these ideas are turned into standards, they stop being slogans and start being requirements teams can follow and leaders can defend. By the end, you should be able to explain why standards matter, what the 4 core themes mean in practical terms, and how standards reduce risk without requiring deep technical expertise. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start by understanding what a standard is and why it sits between policy and day-to-day procedures. A standard is a set of specific, repeatable requirements that support a policy, and it is meant to be applied consistently across teams and projects. The policy might say high-impact AI use is restricted and requires governance approval, while the standard defines what must be provided to earn that approval, such as evidence of evaluation, documentation of data sources, and a monitoring plan. Standards create consistency, and consistency is what prevents each team from inventing its own idea of responsible. Standards also help prevent political decision-making, where approvals depend on persuasion rather than criteria. They make expectations clear early, which reduces wasted effort because teams know what they must produce before they invest heavily in building or buying a system. Standards are also easier to update than policies because they can evolve as tools and regulations change while still preserving the core rules. For beginners, the key insight is that standards turn values into measurable behaviors, and that is the core of defensible governance. Ethics is the first theme, and in responsible AI, ethics means choosing to design and use AI in ways that respect people and avoid preventable harm. Ethical standards often focus on principles like beneficence, meaning the system should aim to produce benefit, and non-maleficence, meaning the system should avoid harm. They also include respect for autonomy, meaning people should not be manipulated or coerced by AI systems, especially in ways they cannot detect. Ethical standards can include requirements around informed use, such as ensuring people understand when AI is involved in decisions that affect them. They can also include requirements around avoiding deceptive practices, such as using AI to impersonate individuals or generate misleading communications. Ethics also touches accountability, because ethical use requires that humans remain responsible for decisions and outcomes, rather than hiding behind automation. For beginners, ethics becomes practical when you ask, does this AI use treat people fairly? Does it respect their rights and expectations? And could it cause harm that we could reasonably prevent? A standard makes those questions part of the required review, not an optional discussion. Fairness is the second theme, and it is often the hardest for beginners because people use the word in different ways. In responsible AI standards, fairness usually means the system should not create unjustified disparities in outcomes or treatment across groups, especially in decisions that affect opportunities, rights, or access. Fairness also means the system should work reliably for the populations it affects, not just for the majority group represented in training data. A fairness standard might require that teams test performance across relevant groups and contexts and document the results, rather than reporting only an overall accuracy number. It might require that teams identify potential proxy signals that could lead to discriminatory outcomes, even if sensitive characteristics are not used directly. It might require that human decision-makers understand the limits of the system and do not treat outputs as unquestionable. Fairness also includes process fairness, meaning people should have a way to ask questions, request review, or appeal when AI influences a decision about them. For beginners, the key is recognizing that fairness risk can exist even when nobody intended harm, and standards help catch that risk through consistent evaluation and documentation. Transparency is the third theme, and transparency in AI is about making the system's use and behavior understandable enough for the right audiences. Transparency does not always mean revealing every technical detail, because many stakeholders do not need that, and sometimes details can be sensitive. Instead, transparency means that the organization can explain what the system is for, what data it uses in broad terms, what limitations exist, how outputs should be interpreted, and what oversight controls are in place. It also means the organization can trace decisions, meaning it can show who approved the use case, what evidence supported approval, and what monitoring is happening. Transparency standards might require clear documentation of intended use, known limitations, and expected performance. They might also require user-facing disclosures in contexts where people are affected by automated decisions. Transparency is deeply tied to trust and legal defensibility, because when someone challenges an outcome, the organization needs to explain its process. For beginners, transparency is not about being verbose. It is about being clear and accountable, so reliance on AI is justified and explainable. Oversight is the fourth theme, and it is the mechanism that keeps ethics, fairness, and transparency from becoming one-time activities. Oversight means humans and governance structures actively supervise AI use over time, with authority to intervene when risk increases. Oversight includes decision rights, meaning who can approve deployment, who can require changes, and who can stop use when harm is detected. It includes monitoring, meaning the organization tracks performance, drift, incident signals, and fairness indicators over time. It includes periodic review, meaning the system is reevaluated when conditions change, like new data sources, new user populations, or changes in business processes. Oversight also includes escalation, meaning clear triggers that require leadership attention when risk exceeds tolerance. A standard might require that high-impact systems have documented oversight roles and that monitoring results are reported on a regular cadence. For beginners, oversight is the discipline that prevents the set-and-forget mistake, which is one of the most common AI risk failures. Now let's connect these themes to the idea of evidence, because standards are only as strong as the evidence they require. Evidence is what proves that a team did the work, that the system was evaluated, and that risk controls exist. For ethics, evidence might include documentation of intended use and prohibited use, and a review of potential harms. For fairness, evidence might include evaluation results across relevant groups and contexts and analysis of error patterns. For transparency, evidence might include user-facing communication plans, documentation of limitations, and records of approvals and decision rationales. For oversight, evidence might include monitoring plans, defined ownership, and escalation triggers. The standard should require that evidence exists before deployment for high-impact systems, because post-hoc evidence is often impossible or unconvincing after harm occurs. A key beginner insight is that evidence is not about proving perfection. It is about proving responsible process. Responsible process is what leaders can defend under scrutiny. Another practical part of responsible AI standards is managing trade-offs, because in real life you often cannot maximize every goal at once. Improving privacy might reduce the amount of data available for training, which might affect accuracy. Increasing transparency might require simplifying how outputs are presented, which might reduce some nuance. Tightening oversight might slow deployment, which can frustrate business teams seeking speed. Standards help manage these trade-offs by making them explicit and by defining minimum acceptable requirements. They also help prevent trade-offs from being made silently by individual teams without organizational approval. If a team wants to accept lower transparency to gain speed, the governance model should force that decision into the open where leaders can decide whether it aligns with appetite. If a team wants to accept more error in a high-impact use case, tolerance boundaries should trigger escalation. Responsible AI is not about eliminating trade-offs, but about making trade-offs visible and intentional rather than accidental. For exam questions, you often need to choose the answer that reflects deliberate trade-off management through governance and evidence. Standards should also scale with impact, because applying maximum requirements to every AI use will cause the process to be ignored. Low-impact uses may require simple documentation, basic data restrictions, and general guidance on human responsibility. Higher-impact uses require deeper fairness evaluation, stronger transparency expectations, and more rigorous oversight. The organization should be able to apply a lighter standard to an internal drafting assistant than to a system influencing customer eligibility decisions. This scaling is one of the most important design choices because it determines whether standards are used in practice. If standards are too heavy, teams will avoid them and create shadow use, which increases risk dramatically. If standards are too light, high-impact uses will slip through with weak controls. The best model uses proportionality, which means matching standard requirements to harm potential. For beginners, the core point is that standards exist to make responsibility practical, not to punish innovation. A common misconception is that responsible AI standards must be entirely technical, like a list of model metrics and complex testing methods. Technical evaluation matters, but standards can be written in a way that focuses on outcomes, documentation, and oversight without requiring every stakeholder to understand algorithms. For example, a fairness standard can require that fairness concerns are assessed and that results are documented and reviewed, without specifying advanced statistical methods in the standard itself. A transparency standard can require that limitations are communicated and that decisions are traceable, without demanding that every model is fully interpretable. Oversight standards can require monitoring and escalation, without dictating exactly which tools must be used. This is especially relevant in AI risk governance because many AI systems are purchased from vendors, and the organization may not have access to all internal details. Standards should be designed to be enforceable even when the system is a black box, by requiring process controls and evidence. The exam mindset often rewards standards that are realistic and defensible rather than overly technical. To make this feel real, imagine a high-impact AI use case where an organization wants to use AI to prioritize which customers receive certain services. A responsible AI standard would require a documented intended use, an analysis of potential harms, and explicit restrictions on prohibited use. It would require evidence that the system was evaluated for performance and fairness, with attention to whether certain groups are consistently disadvantaged. It would require transparent communication for internal decision-makers about limitations and possibly disclosures for customers, depending on context. It would require an oversight plan defining who monitors outcomes, how often performance is reviewed, and what triggers escalation to leadership. The standard would also require that decisions and approvals are recorded so accountability is clear. This example shows how ethics, fairness, transparency, and oversight become practical requirements that shape the deployment. Without these standards, the organization might deploy quickly and only discover problems after harm occurs. To close, building standards for responsible AI is how organizations turn their policies and values into consistent, defensible practice. Ethics standards focus on avoiding preventable harm, respecting people, and preventing deceptive or manipulative use. Fairness standards focus on preventing unjustified disparities and ensuring the system works reliably across the populations it affects. Transparency standards focus on making AI use understandable, traceable, and explainable enough to build trust and meet obligations. Oversight standards focus on ongoing supervision, monitoring, escalation, and the authority to intervene as conditions change. Together, these standards reduce AI risk by requiring evidence and consistency, while still allowing innovation within clear boundaries. As we move forward, these standards will connect directly to documentation expectations, inventories of AI systems, and the practical mechanics of running an AI risk program. When standards are clear and proportional, they become the daily operating definition of responsible AI. And that is exactly what leaders need when they are asked to defend their AI choices.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.